Tip number 1, determine your order of operations. And what do I mean by that? Well, what do you want to do first? Now, depending on your starting scenario and the resources you have, this may change a bit, but first things first, let's determine some of these tabs down here. We've got our work tab. Switch that over to the manual priority, and the first three here are always the most important, so it should be highest on your priority list. After that, I like to select plant cutting and growing as the next most important. Afterwards, construction should be also high on your list. Now let's go down here and select our colonist. We're going to open up the health tab and make sure that these lone colonists can self-tend. Also, if you only have one doctor in the colony, they should be able to self-tend as well. Afterwards, we're going to come down to the Assign tab and let's edit our drug policy. It's important that you determine what drugs are best for your colonists to maintain their mood. I do have a tip later coming up about this very issue, so stay tuned. Next, we can come over here and issue our colonists some orders. We're going to want this person to do some harvesting of any berries that may be around in the general vicinity. Now let's unpause it and allow them to pick these berries while we do our first planning of our building. We'll come back to the Orders tab, go select our plans, and I'm going to choose a 15 by 15 size room. Again, I have another tip about this size rooms coming up later, so stay tuned for that. Now, about this time, some berries should be ready. So let's order the pawn to chop some wood down where we intend to be building. This will provide us with lumber and clear out the area so that they can build here. That's great. Now he's got some lumber on the way. So let's select a zone where this person can store our resources and maybe a dumping zone somewhere outside but nearby for any rocks or rubble. And after that, we want to come over here and select our furniture tab. Let's get them a sleeping spot. This is very critical so they have a place to sleep at night. If you can't afford a bedroll, don't worry, still give them some place to sleep indoors. Next, we can come over here to our production tab, and this crafting spot has a lot of good options early on and it can be placed immediately. I usually would open this up and select a bill for some kind of a weapon, whether it be a short bow, a club, or a knife. And as soon as your pawn can get to that, that'll be a very big priority. Next, they should have some lumber ready. So let's go ahead and open our production tab again. Let's lay out where we're going to have our food producing stations. And these are very critical to keep your colonists alive in the beginning. There, we got a butcher table and an oven set up. I've forbid both of them just so our colonist doesn't get overwhelmed with too much stuff right off the bat. Now you're off to a good start. The next step would be to put up the walls and claim your territory, as well as bring in any resources that might be laying on the ground and get those in underneath the roof. Tip number 2, the auto rebuild button and the home zone buttons. Down here in the bottom right, you'll see several icons. This first one is your auto rebuild button. Normally it's turned off by default. I'm going to go ahead and switch that on. And the second one is the auto home zone area, which is turned on by default. And I'm going to switch that off. Normally the auto home zone expands your home area in a very generous space around whatever you've built. But I like to min-max that and make sure that my home zone does not touch anything outside of what I'm building. Now, the first button that we talked about was the auto rebuild button. This is a very handy thing to have turned on. Any structures you've built that are inside of your home zone, such as this little horseshoe peg, will be rebuilt automatically if they're destroyed for any reason. And as you can see, the blueprint has been placed without me having to do it myself. And that's all because it's within the home zone right there. Tip number 3, room size. When I'm playing, I utilize 2 different size rooms. The first one is the 15 by 15. The reason this is a good size is because it fits the orbital trade beacon perfectly, so you can set up an indoor stockpile. And the only downside is that right here in the center, your pawns won't be able to construct a roof. So you're going to need to place some sort of column near the center so that they can finish that roof off and make this a truly enclosed room. The second size is the 11 by 11. This is one of the most handy sizes. First, it fits the sun lamp nearly perfectly, so if you're going for some indoor greenhouses, this is the size you want to go with. And secondly, this 11 measurement is exactly how much you need to make sure the roof is fully covered. If I had a 12 by 12 size room, then there would be a small hole in the center. But any size room which has an 11 measurement, for instance, this has an 11 from north to south, east to west, it goes all the way to 42. This will all be completely roofed over because these two walls are close enough to support the inside of the room. Tip number 4, putting corners on your buildings. If you watch a lot of YouTube videos about RimWorld, you may notice that some players don't put corners on their buildings. This is essentially so that they can reduce the colony wealth and help micromanage that a bit more. It's not necessary to have a corner to contain the heat within this room. The only downside to lacking these corners is if you have fire. If you're playing on a jungle map or a temperate map where there's a lot of woods or forests around you and a lightning strike happens, that fire might creep up to your buildings, and assuming your building is made of all stone, if you have a gap here, fire can travel diagonally into your building. If there is something flammable in this corner and you get a fire in this spot, it will travel inside your building. Tip number 5. Understanding the difference between pemmican, nutrient paste, and kibble, and what these do for your pawns. Let's talk about pemmican first. This is one of the best foods in the game, but it does require research if you're starting on an industrial colony. If you're starting out as a tribal, you'll be able to cook this stuff up right away. Now, there's no debuff. If your pawns eat this, they won't receive any mood debuffs. It lasts for 70 days, but keep in mind that when your pawns go to eat some of this pemmican, they're going to pick up 20. It's not like a meal where they only pick up 1 and then they're full. They need a full stack of 20 to become full off pemmican. The next one we'll look at is the nutrient paste. Now, this comes from a dispenser, which you will have to research whether you're tribal or industrial. Neither starts with the nutrient paste dispenser researched. But the upside is that you will never receive food poisoning from these, and you don't need a cook. All you need is electricity connected to your food dispenser. Now, the downside is that there is a -4 mood debuff whenever your pawn eats this, as long as it's not a part of their religion. But it's a good option. And the last thing we'll talk about is kibble. This is typically used for animals, but your colonists can eat it and stay alive with kibble. One good thing about it is it's made with hay, which is one of the quickest growing ingredients. And unless hay is used in kibble, your colonists will not be able to eat hay. The second good thing about kibble is that it does not go bad. It has no expiration date on it at all. The downside is that your colonists will get a -12 mood debuff if they eat this. And also remember, if you make it with insect or human meat, they will receive the -12 from eating kibble and a negative mood debuff from eating human meat or insect meat as well. So watch out for that. Tip number 6, don't place floors. You may be tempted to make flooring a part of your colony early game, but it's unnecessary and it can actually hurt you in some ways. This is pure dirt floor inside our kitchen/butchering area, and the good thing about this is dirt cannot get dirty. If your colonists come in from the outside, they won't track dirt in here. There will be no accumulation from dirt or rubble, and it will maintain a fairly steady cleanliness level of around -1. The thing to consider when you're working in your kitchen is that anything below a -2, so -3, -4, that's when you start getting dirty enough to cause food poisoning with your cooks. If you have something like this, it will typically always stay above a -2. Now, the one thing I would recommend is that you separate your butchery room from your kitchen. And this is because as you butcher creatures, you might accumulate some blood or things like that in here, and that would affect the cleanliness of your kitchen area, even with just dirt floors. So avoid placing floors and separate your butcher station from your kitchen. Tip number 7, place stockpiles near your cooking area. It's best for efficiency's sake, especially early game, to have a few stockpiles placed nearby. One of them you're going to want to place for the finished product, and the other one you're going to place for the raw ingredients such as rice and meat. Now this will allow whatever pawn you have to come in, pick up the ingredients, cook, and then immediately place them down here where the pemmican goes without having to move at all, and then repeat the process in a constant cycle. And as long as you have haulers bringing in the raw ingredients, your cook can go on forever and ever until he runs out. Tip number 8, reduce your ingredient radius. If you click on your butcher table or any other crafting station and add a bill such as butcher creature and go to details, you'll see down here a little slider labeled ingredient radius. Now right now it's set to unlimited, meaning this will check the entire map for any relevant ingredients. In this case, butchered carcasses that we can butcher. So I'm going to reduce this down, and soon you'll see the circle here. Let's close this, zoom out a bit, and now you can see I've drastically reduced this ingredient radius check area. Now this is two benefits. Number one, for efficiency. If you have this set to the entire map, then your pawns might be coming down all the way to the edge if they detect a butchered creature, and you might not realize it. The second is later game purposes. If you have several different crafting benches open with bills going and they're checking the entire map all at once, your lag is going to go up. So in order to reduce lag late game, just a small amount at least, you should always reduce your ingredient radius to only what you need, just around your stockpile. Tip number 9, Psychite tea versus smoke leaf. Both of these have a 2% addictiveness rate, which essentially means that you can avoid your pawns becoming addicted to either of these two drugs if you allow them to only use them once every 2 days. Now, beyond that, Psychite tea gives your pawns a plus 40% to recreation bonus whenever they use it. Doesn't have nearly as much bonus as smoke leaf, which gives the pawns a plus 8% recreation and a plus 13 mood buff for using smoke leaf. The downside, which Psychite tea does not have, is that smoke leaf reduces movement speed and it reduces consciousness. That consciousness reduction has some very big downsides. Number one, it kills your manipulation. Your pawns won't produce things as fast, they won't be able to fire as quickly on their guns if they're high on smoke leaf. The second big critical thing to remember with consciousness is that if a pawn's consciousness drops to 0 or below, they will die, regardless of what other conditions they have going on. Now with a 30% reduction every time they use this drug, if your pawn is already low in consciousness for whatever reason, a permanent brain injury or something like that, this can potentially kill them. I highly recommend you deselect smoke leaf from your policies and only use Psychite tea. Tip number 10. Barracks versus bedrooms. A lot of people want to immediately start building individual bedrooms for your pawns, but this is not necessary, and in the beginning it can be very resource intensive. So one way you can counteract that is by building a barrack. Here I've got my 15 by 15 size room with a column in the middle so that the roof is completely covered, and you can see I've set my beds up so that they each encircle a little wooden end table so they get their bonus. I've got 2 wooden dressers here set up, and they're reaching all of these beds. By the way, there's 24 here, so I can fit 24 colonists in this room. And to make this room even better, while still maintaining a low wealth on my colony, I've planted a bunch of daylilies here. Now, these increase the beauty of this room quite dramatically, and they don't give you any extra wealth to your colony. As you can see, this is now a beautiful room. The last thing I should mention is that some colonists don't work well in this setup. You want to keep your eye out for the greedy colonist. Jealous colonists are not so bad. They won't be jealous of someone else in here sleeping, but a greedy colonist wants their own room. They want statues in it and that. So reject the greedy colonist if you're going with a barrack setup. Tip number 11, combine your dining room and rec room. A lot of players have a tendency to build one room for dining and one room for recreation. But again, that can be very resource intensive and boost your wealth unnecessarily. If you combine the two, then you will get both benefits in one single room. As long as your pawns satisfy their food need in this room and satisfy their recreation in this room, they will get both mood buffs from the action. As we can see here on Dashy, he's got one for an extremely impressive dining room because he ate here, and he also played some pool, so he's got the buff for the rec room as well. So remember, combine your rec room and your dining room. Tip number 12, a defensive setup. This is a quick and easy way to give your pawns the maximum amount of cover. What I've done is I've constructed wall, barricade, wall, and I've repeated that. Then you want to order your pawns to stand behind the walls. This will allow them to peek out from either side of the wall while still gaining the benefits of these barricades and the cover that they're next to. Tip number 13, make sure your traps are set up within your home zone. If you place traps within the home zone, then they will be default set to auto rearm. But if you place a trap outside of your home zone, it will set without the auto rearm active. So if you want to keep your traps going over time, make sure that you've placed them within your home zone. Tip number 14, heavy SMGs. The heavy SMG is the best all-around weapon for pawns who do not have a very good shooting skill. In the early game, you want to focus on getting these as quickly as you can for pawns who aren't very talented at shooting. Once your pawns get up to a 13 or 14 in shooting skill, then you can change that out for the assault rifle or better. Tip number 15, defending your Anima tree. If you click on it, you'll see that there's a red circle around here, and any constructed buildings you put inside this circle will reduce the effectiveness of the Anima tree by up to 30%. So if you build enough, it will reduce the rate at which Anima grass grows by 30%. But I recommend you go ahead and do this. You're going to want to build a perimeter around the tree or even build your base completely around the tree. This offers you two different benefits. Number one, your pawns will be completely protected while they're meditating, and they won't be forced to walk across the map and be exposed to potential fire if a raid comes in from the side. The second benefit is efficiency. If your pawns are walking halfway across the map just to get to the Anima tree, that's wasted time that could be better spent meditating at the tree itself. So remember, disregard the 30% debuff and go ahead and build within the circle as much as you want, as long as you're protecting your colonists adequately. Tip number 16 is a quick and easy one. Quest reward preferences. Go to your quest tabs, and in the screen here, look down at the bottom where it says reward preferences. Now, once you've selected this, it'll open up a window, and it shows all these goodwill here, accept goodwill for each faction. If you click these off, leave the honor on there in case you want to get more sidecast abilities, or you want to raise your royalty status with the Empire. Leave that on. But by turning off goodwill here, you will now get 3 treasure rewards instead of 2 plus a goodwill. Tip number 17, setting up the rituals for your religion. It's very important to go ahead and open up all slots you have available, which should be 6 for your religion. And once you've done that, you want to go in and edit each one of these rituals. The first thing you want to do is set the starting condition to any time so that you control when the rituals happen, as opposed to having a calendar date which you might miss and receive a debuff on your pawns because you did not complete the ritual. The second thing you want to do is switch the reward to random recruit. These other options are not as good as potential recruits that you could get from having a good ritual. This helps you especially in late game when it becomes very difficult to recruit new pawns because you have a high population. And as we'll touch on shortly, these new recruits can also serve as sacrifices. Tip number 18. All your pawns should be researching if they are able to. As you recruit more and more pawns, continue to place plenty of research benches around your colony. This will give the pawns the opportunity to research and stay active even once their primary tasks have been completed. You don't want pawns sitting idle on your map, and the only reason they shouldn't be researching is if they simply are restricted from researching. Don't worry about if they have a poor ability, they'll still contribute some small amount to the overall research project. Tip number 19, wealth management. This is an important concept in RimWorld to understand, especially as you get into the harder difficulty levels. Your colony has a total wealth stat, and that can be found down here by looking at the graph and going to the statistics tab, which gives you a numerical value of how much wealth your colony has total. Watch this number and try and keep it as low as possible because it has a direct bearing on the size and the difficulty of raids. Now, another important thing to remember is that any resources which are on the map are considered your colony's wealth. Even like these lumber here, if they're outside my home zone or outside the walls, they're still counted as wealth towards my colony, so keep that in mind. Now, there's a couple ways you can dispense with unwanted wealth. If you have gear that you don't need or anything else that's flammable, you can move it to a dumping stockpile and then throw some Molotov cocktails on it and simply burn it. Or if you have the research, you can set up a transport pod. Go to the transport pod, load it up with whatever items you want to get rid of, and after it's fully loaded, you'll be able to launch it. Now, when you do launch it, you'll see it takes you to the world map, and it shows you this radius. Depending on how much fuel your transport pod has, this radius will get bigger and bigger, and I can send whatever the contents were to any of the settlements here on this map. Click this one, and it's launched as soon as I unpause it. Now that will dispense with the items and their wealth, and it will also give me the secondary benefit of helping improve my relationship with that faction as soon as they receive. Tip number 20, the last tip. Right now I want to talk about the adaptation factor and sacrificing your pawns. The adaptation factor is something that's built into the game of RimWorld itself. Basically what it does is, quote from the wiki, RimWorld tries to make the game harder if it thinks the player is doing well and easier if it thinks the player is doing poorly. So essentially this adaptation factor tracks your progress, and depending on certain criteria such as pawn deaths, injuries, and others, it will balance the game so that it's harder or easier for you based on those factors. Now, you can trick the AI slightly by sacrificing a pawn if they join your colony through a wanderer join event, or for whatever reason you don't want the pawn. Instead of banishing them or doing such and such, sacrifice them. Actually have some of your pawns shoot them or melee them to death. What this will do is it will trick the AI into thinking that you've just lost a colonist, and therefore the next raid or two will be weaker. Now, your colonists will receive a slight debuff because they don't like it when other colonists die, but if you're struggling on harder difficulties, this can help you squeeze through.